The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Ah, the web tour. Those that both creators and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's up, Tilly? This is how you deal with weird!
No! Do not harm my children!
Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket's in trouble, Akasa! Can we turn on the windshield remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this is a super special episode. I'm joined today for a chat with author Elizabeth Chadwick, who you may recognize her name if you're a reader of historical fiction, especially historical fiction set in the medieval period in England and surrounding areas. She's written more than 30 books set in this time period, and we're talking about her latest one, which is set in a time and a place that I've never read. I've never researched before, I've never read about before. It's a book called The King's Jewel, and it begins in Wales in 1093. So in our conversation, she explains what was happening in Wales in 1093, because that was not something I knew about before I read this book at all. It's sharing the story of a Welsh princess named Nesta, sometimes called Nest, and the really interesting and kind of scandalous at times story of what all went on in her life. So I hope you enjoy this chat with Elizabeth Chadwick. So I'm joined here today by Elizabeth Chadwick. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much.
I'm really excited to talk to you about your latest book, The King's Jewel. And part of that is because this book is about a time period I've never read about before, a time and a place. Can you explain the setting of this book?
Well, it's set partly in Wales and partly in England. It's set in the late 11th over to the early 12th century, which is 1093, going up to the 1110s, 1115. And it's the story of a Welsh princess from an area of lower end of Wales, South Wales, who after her father was killed, is abducted, or should say taken hostage, taken prisoner by the Normans who were invading. They'd invaded England in 1066 and were expanding ever westwards. And as part of their expansion, they were taking over parts of Wales. Nesta and her family became part of that hostile takeover, and she was taken prisoner and taken to England, where she became the unwilling concubine of the future King Henry I, who was known in his lifetime to have fathered more than 20 illegitimate children on various different women. So it's Nesta's story and how she deals with her life, and when she's sold in marriage to another Norman man, how she goes about making a life and coming to terms with still being Welsh and yet being this unwilling Norman concubine and bride.
Can you remind everyone, because I know there are people listening from the US and other places who might need a refresher on who the Normans were, what that situation was?
The Normans were, well, basically Nordic people, Viking types, I suppose, is an easy, popular way of saying it, who'd settled in northern France by conquest, being given land in the north of France called Normandy. And gradually they began looking to expand. And England was just 26 miles across the English Channel. And the Normans under William the Conqueror, who listeners might have heard of William the Conqueror, came across the Channel and took over the English nation, replaced the Anglo-Saxon hierarchy with a Norman one. So the language changed from the language at the top changed from English to French. And then William the Conqueror rewarded his followers with land, and they were always land hungry. So they kept pushing onto other boundaries. So they looked to Scotland, they looked to Wales. Eventually, they even looked across to Ireland to bring their conquest over there. The Normans were very successful soldiers, very warlike, and they also took over other parts of Europe, including Sicily. So they moved into Italy as well. So they were sort of a proactive military nation.
And then the king at the start of this book is William Rufus, right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, he was the eldest son of William the Conqueror. He didn't have any children, but his younger brother, very ambitious Henry, who was the youngest of the William the Conqueror's children, was at court with him and had an eye to the main chance. Another brother called Robert was away on crusade, and while Robert was away on crusade, young Henry was making hay and bid for the throne, if you like. William Rufus didn't have any children. He was very possibly, though we can't, there's no actual proof, but he may have been homosexual, but we don't know for certain. But certainly he didn't marry, and the next heir to the throne would either have been young Henry or brother Robert, who was out of operations at the time elsewhere.
And so tell me more about Nesta and how did you first come upon the story of this Welsh princess?
I guess because it comes back to actually Pembroke Castle, and I have written later medieval things about William Marshall, a man called William Marshall, who was Lord of Pembroke, and also Richard de Clare, the same. Pembroke's in South Wales. And I became interested in the origins of what was going on in that area. And quite often Princess Nesta, she has both names, kept coming into it, and how she had married a Norman warlord and founded a rich dynasty down in the area of South Wales that had been her home. And so she comes into the history generally speaking, if you actually research that area and that period. So she kept coming up on my radar. As well, her children, with Gerald, her first husband, she had at least 3 husbands, but her first husband, Gerald, who was her longest lasting one, then the Fitzgerald Kennedys are one of their descendants, that particular branch. So they had an illustrious lot of descendants later on. And another thing was also that her grandson, who was also called Gerald after his grandfather, Gerald of Wales, his books are still in print now. He was a bit of a gossipy, I suppose you'd call him a tabloid journalist these days. He made up all sorts of he told all sorts of interesting stories, and they are still, you can still get hold of them today in translation. So I knew about him, and I love to holiday in that part of the world. It's beautiful in Pembrokeshire, absolutely beautiful. And so, again, I was steeping myself in the history and the surroundings.
Well, and I want to let people know who haven't read your book yet that you really do write with a very the sense of place is there. I'm not surprised to hear that you have frequently visited the areas you're talking about. It very much comes through in the writing.
Thank you. Yes, I've been to Pembroke numerous times. Normally we hire a holiday cottage for a week. I've done talks at Pembroke Castle, Cardigan Castle, and I've been to Carew, which doesn't look anything like where Nesta was born and brought up, but because the castle is a lot later now. But the whole general area, and my son was at university in Aberystwyth, which isn't that much further up the coast, and so we were always toing and froing to Wales. So it's like I'm not Welsh, I don't have any Welsh blood, but I still feel like it's a form of home.
Well, and that reminds me too, in the book, what we see happen with Nesta is, I mean, she's taken away from her land, from her culture, but she really holds strong to her language, to her Welsh roots. I thought, again, I don't think I've ever read a book about a Welsh person before. So it was very interesting to me, and I appreciate how much I learned about the culture through her and through her determination to, give her children Welsh names and to retain this sense of identity.
I think that was fascinating, actually, because she had a Norman husband who, given the way the Normans were, could have named all his children with Norman names. And when you read the history books these days, you do see like the sons William and Maurice have that thing going on. But David, you could use both ways. It's both Welsh and Norman. But the daughter, Angharad, that means beloved. And it's a Welsh name. And Gladys, his youngest. So the girls both had completely Welsh names, which I thought was interesting. I think Gerald himself probably had a thing for Wales.
Well, and that's the sort of clue I would imagine when you're piecing together to try to turn historical snippets into a novel. You're trying to figure out what was this woman's character like, and that's a sort of hint that maybe told you her Welsh heritage remained important. Just looking at the names of the children.
I think so. I think absolutely. You do get that sense of it, and the fact as well that Gerald accepted her brother into his. She had a brother called Griffith, who went into exile in Ireland as a little boy when she was first captured. But then he returned, and he was, allowed to he was sat around the family table, and they helped him when they could. And this is completely with Gerald's permission. So you see here that Nesta must have had some influence over Gerald, and Gerald must have had his own input into this story to be letting her brother come and stay with them when their brother was a bit ambiguous about Normans, as well as fellow Welsh. The Welsh themselves fought among each other ferociously.
Well, and that was what was interesting to me as well about this book, that was set in a time and place where, in retrospect, we look back and we know the result of the expansion of England into Wales and things like that. But at that time, anything was possible. Anyone could have captured anybody. So there's a strong sense of uncertainty, I found.
Yes, definitely. You never know who was going to stab you in the back, literally as well as figuratively, because the Welsh Wales was divided into kingdoms or principalities, and the rulers were all struggling for power themselves and would raid each other's lands indiscriminately and make pacts. So one minute they'd be friends, the next minute they'd be deadly enemies, and you never knew which way it was going to turn. Literally on a small coin, they would change their minds, and they would take cattle, horses, people. They would capture people and then sell them in Ireland on the Dublin slave blocks. And so all this was going on amongst the Welsh themselves, and then you get the Norman element coming in, and then everybody. So it's just like one big brawl. And some of the Welsh might think, oh well, if we ally with the Normans, we'll get one up on our neighbours there. That'll make them weaker, which is what Nesta's father in fact did. He allied with William the Conqueror. Until William the Conqueror died, Nesta's father was secure in his lands. It was only when William Rufus came to the throne and saw all these hungry Normans waiting like vultures and said, "Oh, all right, then go on," that Nesta's father then suffered the consequences.
I find it also very interesting. And your books, I believe, primarily focus on the stories of women from history. So it was really interesting to me also to get into this time and place in this warlike history, but from the point of view of a woman who, although she's very strong-minded, and she does what she can, she's trapped in so many ways. She's not able to be involved because she's just tucked away.
I think that's absolutely true. Women were strong, but they had to be strong in other ways, I think, a lot of the time. And that quite often meant being quite cunning and working out, how am I going to do this, and how does this work? And so they stood in their own light, I think, is one of the things. I do write about men. I like to write from male viewpoint too. I like to give a bit of both, because men have their opinions and their mindsets as well. So there are different ways that women look at the world and ways that men look at the world, I think. And that's generally speaking, because there's lots of overlap.
Well, and in this book as well, you get the point of view. It's not all Nesta's story. You sort of expand outward. Gerald, we get to see from his point of view as well.
Yes, that's right. And I was interested in how a man like Gerald comes to live this castle and get this Welsh princess for his wife. What's he done to earn it, if you like, and why does he love Wales, and what's his person like? And I find usually when I start researching, because when I begin writing a novel, I research enough to need to know to begin writing. But I always ask my main characters, my protagonists, what can you tell me that you haven't told anyone else before? And then they come and they tell me, if you like. But at the same time, while I'm working on that, I'm asking, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is this to have happened? And if it's an 8 or more, then I'll go with it. I know I'm writing fiction, but I like to have it based in reality and to be plausible. And if it's between an 8 and a 10, then I'll go with it. And if I think, no, that's not really likely, then I'll find a way round. And I think there's always a way round. There's always a way round. You just have to think harder and let your subconscious work harder too.
What sources were you able to find to learn about what facts we know about Nesta and her life?
Well, there is a raft of resources. I've probably had to go to some primary stuff. There's a Welsh chronicle, and I'm terrible. My pronunciation of Welsh is terrible. It's the Bruti Twisogion, and any Welsh people listening are probably screaming at me that's completely the wrong pronunciation. But it's a chronicle that was written from the I think 6th century. Don't quote me on that. All the way up to the 13th century of the doings in Wales, and it's written in Welsh, and I've got a Welsh one side, translation into English the other. So that gives you the basics. It's got a few things wrong. Sometimes the date lines are a bit dodgy, but the story is there. And there's also, I've got a book of Welsh laws from the period, medieval Welsh laws that tell you what rules Welsh people lived by, called the triads, and various other Welsh folk tales. It's all the primary source bits and pieces. And then I go to secondary source academic works. So I found a couple of biographies of Nesta that I read while going along. And then I go and look at, if anybody got a university thesis out online, get hold of that, and a couple of other textbooks on Wales. So it's all being read as I go along. I mean, I read enough to get started, and then while I'm writing that first draft, I am deepening that knowledge more and more until by the time I get to the 4th or 5th draft, I might think, that needs altering. But generally speaking, I've got a good grounding.
And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hi, this is Rob Benedict.
And I am Richard Spate. We were both on a little show you might know called Supernatural.
It had a pretty good run, 15 seasons, 327 episodes.
And though we have seen, of course, every episode many times, we figured, hey, now that we're wrapped, let's watch it all again.
And we can't do that alone. So we're inviting the cast and crew that made the show along for the ride. We've got writers, producers, composers, directors, and we'll of course have some actors on as well, including some certain guys that played some certain pretty iconic brothers.
It was kind of a little bit of a left field choice in the best way possible.
The note from Kripke was, he's great, we love him, but we're looking for like a really intelligent Duchovny type.
With 15 seasons to explore, it's going to be the road trip of several lifetimes. So please join us and subscribe to Supernatural Then and Now.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.
And we're back. So I read your book, obviously, and then I thought, well, what was the real story? So I just did some very amateur, very quick sleuthing just to determine. Yeah, I mean, the plot points, like the major things that happen in your book, are what Nesta's story really was. And I thought, my goodness, why isn't this story better known?
It's an amazing. I know, and there's another lady who's written about it. Her name escapes me. She's written a set of novels about Nesta, and she does crop up now and again. But no, she's not widely covered. So I felt that she needed her storytelling. I think one of the things that interested me as well as part of her story is because she became the mistress or concubine of King Henry I. I've always seen people go on about, oh, he had 20 children. What a lover he must have been. And I thought, that's not true. You know, I don't think that's quite the truth. You know, because a lot of these were quite young girls who were his hostages or were given to him as gifts by their families for a bit of preferential treatment, you know, to the family. So I was interested in exploring it from a point of view of a woman who had been one of his conquests, if you like. So that was just part of the mix of being interested in Nesta. You know.
No, and that's such an important point as well. I think I know there's certainly other figures in history where I think they get a similar sort of favorable reaction, saying, "Oh, what a Lothario this was." Where you think, well, was that's not quite true. That's not quite what the situation was. Yeah,
absolutely. So I wanted to set things as I felt right by Nesta, and by Nesta especially because, you know, she had a lot to go through, a lot to deal with. One of the things that fascinated me when doing the research was that there are two castles involved in. There's a story in it where Nesta basically saves Gerald's life by telling him to hide. I won't go further into it than that, but she tells him he has to hide from an enemy. And this particular scenario is quite often. I mean, you can Google it if you want. It's quite big. But the castle of Kilgarran, up near the Welsh border, near Cardigan, claims that this is where this incident happened. And then if you go down to Carew, they also claim it happened, and it's both in the guidebooks. So then the author's going, right, which one? Which one? So I had to just choose where to set this scene, and both guidebooks tell me that it was at their castle, which I chose the one that seemed the most obvious to me. But it was interesting to see that a bit of competition even these days between two tourist attractions to have the scene happen at their particular castle.
That's so interesting. And that kind of speaks to, because her story, my sense of it, is that there are factual things. We know she lived, we know this was her husband, but it's almost to a level of mythology or almost a fairy tale, the story of it. Yeah,
there's definitely, it's very hard to find Nesta in the in history. You've really got to dig for the nuggets of it, and then and ask questions about what happened. How did this happen? It's she was known as the Helen of Wales, which meant that so the suggestion is that she was very beautiful, and we know that Gerald was born at Windsor Castle in England, where his father was in charge of the castle. So we know that Gerald had, although he was a younger son, would have had excellent training in everything. How he got to Wales and into the employ of the Montgomerys, who knows? Those things just aren't told in history. So you just have to find a way that seems plausible and feels right. It is very, very difficult.
Well, and that's what I really admire about the work you've done in this book, is to take, well, you're describing, is this an 8 out of 10 plausibility? So for you to be presented with a list of facts, and some of them just on paper, you think, well, how on earth how are you going to turn this into a plausible plot twist? How are you going to have your character believably do this situation? So you're just kind of coloring in the spaces between these facts. So I think that,
exactly.
Yeah.
That's it. You have to colour in the spaces. I mean, there's some definite set piece scenes. I mean, there's a siege early on in the story at Pembroke Castle where Gerald's enemy Owain of Powys was. We know he was present. We know that Gerald played a trick on him to persuade him that the castle was stuffed to the rafters with goodies when it wasn't. So that is down in the history books. So you can think, I can really get a good siege written out of this, But then there are other bits that you think, there are just gaps where you have to think, look at the wider history and see what was happening and who was around. And then sometimes you can make deductions. Well, if so-and-so was there and this happened then so-and-so must have happened and must have been. And it's like this, where these two castles that claim that the escape incident happened there, you find one's only 4 miles from where the enemy lived, Owain of Powys. And that he was at a feast there within that timeline. And then the other castle is way down south, a couple of hundred miles in the middle of Gerald's territory, rather than on the border with Powys. So what's more likely? Which is the 8 out of 10 of those?
Yeah. Well, and I wonder too, when we're looking at something that happened so long ago, for instance, these two castles, and who's to say where anything happened? You just explained which is more likely, but at what point in history did the other castles start saying, oh, actually, that happened here, and that was a way to get people to visit that? Maybe that happened 500 years ago, so there's still a history to that claim. It's such a long period of time since this all actually happened.
Yeah, I suppose, yes. This happens, I think, throughout history. Wherever you go, you hear the myths and the legends, and then you have to really dig underneath to see what you can find, to see what's more likely. And sometimes there are definite clues there.
Well, and that's why I guess also too, you're saying you looked at some of the primary sources as well, where if you can find, what were people saying as close as possible to when these events happened, versus what did somebody write about it, I don't know, for instance, in the 19th century or something like that. You want to find, hopefully, the most accurate.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm still finding things now. Just to go off to another novel at the moment. If I may mention another novel I'd written, it's I wrote a trilogy about Eleanor of Aquitaine, who's a bit later, not much later, 12th century, Queen of England, wife of Henry II, and it's mentioned, and all her biographers mention it, that this is modern biographers, not way back, that she had a half brother called Jocelyn. And I thought, well, if I'm going to put this Jocelyn in a story, I need to find out a bit more about him. So I went to where he's supposedly mentioned in this documentation. Its primary source, it's a thing called a pipe roll, which is like a list of expenses for the court. And here it was written in English, or I translated it from Latin. I read Latin badly, but I can get an idea. And there it was, Jocelyn, brother of the Queen. And I thought, oh, there he is. And he's been given this land in Petworth in Sussex. Right. And then you find out that actually brother of the Queen doesn't mean Queen Eleanor. It means another queen who lived earlier, and that Jocelyn is her half-brother.
Oh.
But historians and biographers haven't picked up on it. So you read a biography of Eleanor of Aquitaine, say by Alison Weir, and there she's talking about this person who isn't actually the half-brother of Eleanor of Aquitaine. And I found that out for myself just by research reading. And I thought, do I put it? So I don't put him in my book because he doesn't belong there. You know, if I hadn't gone and backed myself up, I'd have probably given him lots of scenes in the book, given him shoes he didn't own.
Yeah.
So I like to dig.
Like, that's such a perfect example. And that's so interesting that one person interprets a fact in a certain way, and then the next several biographies use that person as their source, and then suddenly it becomes accepted truth.
Exactly, that's it. And once it's in the mainstream, it's very, very hard to get it out of the mainstream. I find myself on history forums sometimes typing it and thinking, why are you doing this? Because it's such a big wave of once it hits mainstream. But I like to feel that I don't get everything right. And I would never claim to be that. And I don't say I'm accurate. I just say I try for authenticity, which is a different thing. But I do my best.
Well, and I mean, how many historical fiction books? You have 30 at this point. Clearly your best is...
I think so. I need to count them on my fingers. It's getting up that way since 1990. But I wrote my first one when I was 15 because I'd always told myself stories verbally. And I finally wrote something down when I was 15 and thought, I want to do this for a living. But, when you're 15, I needed to grow up, really, to start with. So I got published when I was 31. So it took me 60 years to actually find a publisher. But I was learning my trade. And at the same time, I was becoming more and more interested in what I was writing.
Well, and that just brings me to another question, which would be, so finding a figure like Nesta, I feel, to you as a writer, I would imagine it's such a gift to have a story with so many built in, these, I think you call them set pieces, these major events that happen. So I thought, when I read the book, I thought, why isn't this story as well known as Elizabeth Woodville? It's such a good story. So how, I would imagine as a historical author, you're never going to run out of new people to discover, new stories to write.
Oh, absolutely not. No, I usually, if I'm for my next person, next person I'm going to write about, I'll sort of look up biographies and I'll look at a mention that interests me, and then I will ask. That's when I start asking questions like, "Who are you? Why should I write about you? What can you tell me?" Every time I look a bit further or read a bit further, then that question gets answered, and I think yes, So that's something speaks to me. Medieval period is my period. I've been doing it since I was a teenager, I suppose. And so 1066 onwards, I've gone a bit later recently, but that sort of area, 1300, absolutely fascinates me, and I'm quite at home in it.
And I guess just as sort of one final question, related to what you were just saying, finding the stories that speak to you, do you find in writing about the past, are you does it make you see things in modern day differently, or do you see connections between the experiences of people in the medieval time and the experiences of people today?
I think so. I think it does tell you that technology changes, but people don't. And technology might just change people slightly, but we're still wired to do exactly the same things. And I see exactly the same things going on then as happen now, except we're on a global scale with different technology, but it's exactly the same behaviours. So to me, nothing changes. I do think writers are, I would say, a bridge. You build a bridge if you're writing historical fiction between now and then you invite readers to cross your bridge. Not every reader's going to like what they see on the other side or want to cross your bridge, and some are going to use it as their preferred bridge. You don't know which, but that's my job, to provide a bridge for people to walk into the past.
And I think you did such a lovely job of that in this book, and thank you so much for talking to me about your book today.
Thank you very much for asking me. It's been lovely. Thank you.
So I just want to clarify, when Elizabeth mentioned that Nesta is the ancestor of the Fitzgerald Kennedy family, like that means like JFK, like John Fitzgerald Kennedy, like the Kennedys, that dynasty had their roots, I mean, from Nesta. So, which is fascinating to me to see how far back that family dynasty goes, but also just a connection between a story that feels so long ago to a dynasty that's still around today. So again, this book is called The King's Jewel by Elizabeth Chadwick. It should be available anywhere you get your books from. And if you like that, I mean, Elizabeth has got quite a back catalog of other books of historical people, men and women, as she explained. And you can also find more out about her. She has a website, just elizabethchadwick.com. And so this show that you're listening to right now is Vulgar History. My name is Anne Foster. And you can keep up with this show. And also, if you're like, what are the... I've been doing more and more of these author conversations, which is so fun for me and so fascinating. And I hope you enjoy learning from people who have done the research, hearing them explain how they put these stories together. I've got a whole list of all of the authors who I've spoken to and who I will be speaking to on this podcast at my bookshop link. And there's a link to that in the show notes of this episode. If you want to just go back through and see all the books that we've talked about on this podcast, they're all there in various lists. And if you want to keep up with this podcast and with me, I'm on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod. I'm on TikTok at Vulgar History. You can reach out to me. There's a form at vulgarhistory.com, or you can also email me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. I also have a Patreon where if you support this podcast for at least $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to all episodes of this podcast. And if you pledge at least $5 a month, you get bonus episodes as well. So until next time, my friends, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Anne Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth.
Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Do you know what lies within nothing?
No.
Do you know where it ends? Do you want to know?
Yes.
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.